Lady Juliana Whitlock had always been too quiet for London. Her elder sister, Clarissa, possessed the kind of dazzling, careless beauty that attracted dukes like moths to a fatal flame, and 5 years ago, one particular flame had been quenched in a bitter, public humiliation that sent the Marquess of Ravensbury into a self-imposed exile. Now the Marquess had returned as the Duke, a cold, powerful force of nature with a memory as long as his title. His vengeance was a precisely calculated weapon aimed at the Whitlock family. He sought to compromise the most valuable asset, the most innocent daughter, and thereby shatter their name forever. He chose Juliana. He expected to find a vain, easily manipulated girl to use as a sacrificial pawn. Instead, Alistair Vane, the ruthless Duke of Ravensbury, found her in a dusty bookshop, discoursing on the logistics of Hadrian's Wall, with an earnest intelligence that disarmed him utterly. He had planned to destroy her. He found himself wanting only to know her. In his pursuit of ruin, the Duke found an unexpected, terrifying truth. The innocent wallflower he intended to break was the only woman who could save his heart, if his wicked secret didn't destroy her first. Chapter 1. The Duke's Target. The season of 1818, much like the years before it, held little charm for Lady Juliana Whitlock. She was the forgotten piece on the grand chessboard of London society, a small, quiet presence, whose function, it seemed, was merely to make her elder sister, the dazzling, vivacious, and utterly unforgiving Lady Clarissa, shine all the brighter. Clarissa was a comet, brilliant, blinding, and leaving a trail of scorched earth in her wake. 5 years ago, one such piece of scorched earth had been the then Marquess of Ravensbury. Now he was the Duke, and the name alone caused a ripple of respectful and often fearful silence to fall over any drawing-room he entered. Juliana, in contrast, was the moon, modest, reflecting a borrowed, distant light. She much preferred the shadowed corners of ballrooms, where she could observe the dizzying spectacle of society without becoming entangled in its silly, vicious games. Her refuge was the well-worn leather of books, the complexity of a difficult sonata, and the privacy of her own quiet, intelligent mind, a mind her family had long since dismissed as disappointingly unmarriageable. It was this very preference for quietude that had shielded Juliana from the full brunt of her family's decline. They were not ruined, not yet, but the Whitlocks were fraying at the edges. Her father, the Earl, was a man perpetually in need of a successful investment, and her mother, a woman who measured the value of her daughters by the weight of their diamond necklaces, was frantic for Clarissa to secure a wealthy match. Juliana, the innocent daughter, remained largely invisible, a fact that was about to become acutely perilous. The return of Alistair Vane, the 6th Duke of Ravensbury, to the glittering, gossiping landscape of Mayfair had been abrupt and, to all who knew his history, deeply suspicious. 5 years had passed since a certain public and scandalous exchange with Lady Clarissa Whitlock had forced him to quit London for the continent. Now he was back, no longer the fiery, easily provoked young Marquess, but a man carved from granite and shadowed by a chilling, controlled power. He sat now in the dimly lit library of his townhome, a ledger open before him, but his true focus was the stack of carefully curated documents detailing the financial and social vulnerability of the Whitlock family. Alistair Vane, Duke of Ravensbury, was not a man to forgive or forget. The humiliation Clarissa had inflicted, a public, calculated lie that had cost him a vital military commission and his family's honor, had festered, hardening into a cold, unyielding ambition for vengeance. He had returned to London with a single brutal purpose: to dismantle the Whitlock name piece by agonizing piece. He had decided his attack must be precise, lasting, and utterly devastating. Ruining the Earl financially was fleeting. Ruining the family socially was an enduring monument to his retribution. And the most effective way to shatter their fragile standing was to compromise the daughter they considered the most valuable, the most innocent, the most easily broken. He had intended to target Juliana. The reports described her as the lesser daughter, shy and overly studious, possessing a ludicrous sensibility, a perfect, unwitting victim whose ruination would send shockwaves through the family, and, better yet, be a private yet agonizing blow to Clarissa's pride. Alistair was not a man of sentiment. He considered his plan a necessary act of social warfare, a just repayment of a debt of dishonor. Their meeting, however, did not occur in a grand public confrontation as Alistair had planned, but in the hushed, almost sacramental quiet of Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly. Juliana was perched precariously on a rolling ladder, her attention entirely consumed by a volume of obscure Roman history balanced in her hand. Her bonnet had slipped, allowing a few soft brown curls to escape and frame a profile that was far more delicate and thoughtful than the grand society portraits suggested. She wore a gown of muted lavender that spoke of taste rather than fashionable expense, and she was entirely oblivious to the tall, imposing figure who had paused below her. Alistair had been searching for an old map. Instead, he found himself utterly arrested by the sight of her. The reports had been correct. She was nothing like her sister. Clarissa was fire and artifice. Juliana was quiet light and unstudied grace. As she stretched to replace the book, the latter gave a sickening lurch. Juliana gasped, eyes wide with alarm, and the Duke acted instantly. His long stride closing the distance, he reached up, grasping her waist with a powerful, instinctive grip, just as she was about to tumble onto the floorboards. She landed, heart-pounding, not on the dusty floor, but firmly against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant murmur of the shop. His hands, large and warm, remained locked around her waist. "My apologies, my lady," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through her thin muslin dress. "You are quite safe." Juliana finally managed to push away, her cheeks burning crimson. She curtsied awkwardly, her eyes fixed on the silver buttons of his perfectly tailored coat. "Thank you, Your Grace. It was exceedingly clumsy of me. I was quite lost in the campaign logistics of Hadrian's Wall." The admission was utterly unexpected. Most young ladies, upon being saved by a duke, would have offered vapid compliments or a pretty swoon. This one spoke of Roman fortifications. Alistair looked down at her, at the intelligent warmth in her hazel eyes, the slight tremble of her hand as she smoothed her skirt, and the quiet dignity that warred with her evident shyness. He saw no vanity, no artifice, only an overwhelming sense of relief and a depth of intellect that startled him. She was not fragile, he realized with a jolt. She was simply contained. "Hadrian's Wall," he echoed, a small, genuine smile, a terrifyingly attractive sight, touching the corner of his mouth. A fascinating study in defensive architecture. "Tell me, Lady Juliana, do you find the wall's success was due to the terrain or the command structure?" And just like that, the Duke who had intended to ruin her found himself standing in a dusty corner of a bookshop conversing with his intended victim about ancient Roman history. Juliana, utterly unaware of the danger before her, blossomed under the attention. Here was a man who saw past the quiet gown and the eclipsed social standing to the mind she usually kept so carefully hidden. Her shyness receded, replaced by the fervor of genuine interest. Alistair watched the animation in her face, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of strategy and discipline. He saw a flicker of something deeply wounded behind the intellectual shield, a quiet sorrow she guarded fiercely. He had intended to compromise her, to break her for the sins of her sister, but in this moment, his precise, brutal plan wavered. The revenge felt suddenly crude, clumsy, a heavy hammer aimed at a delicate mechanism. He was drawn to her gentle strength, to the honest intelligence that disarmed him completely. This attraction was not a part of the strategy. It was an unruly, dangerous anomaly that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of his revenge. He had chosen her to destroy the Whitlocks. Now he was suddenly terribly afraid that in doing so, he might be destroying something within himself. Chapter 2. A Trap That Became a Confession. The incident in the bookshop marked a silent, momentous shift. Alistair, the Duke of Ravensbury, was now consumed by a duplicity that chafed against his pride. His original intent, to cultivate Juliana's acquaintance for the sole cruel purpose of compromising her reputation and shattering her family, was now tangled with a genuine, undeniable fascination. He found himself seeking her out, not merely as a target, but as a balm to the hard, lonely shell he had built around his heart. He began the pursuit with the practiced, effortless charm of a powerful man. He danced with her twice at the Duchess of Devonshire's ball, ignoring the raised eyebrows of the ton who remembered his bitter history with Clarissa. He sent her a rare first edition of Tacitus, a gift that spoke directly to her intellect rather than her vanity. He orchestrated accidental meetings in Kensington Gardens, where they spoke not of social gossip or eligible matches, but of philosophy, the duties of the landed gentry, and the subtle melancholy that seemed to cling to both their souls. Juliana, completely innocent of his true motives, began to bloom. The Duke's attention was a sun she had never known. For years, she had existed in the shadow of her sister's dazzling light and her family's dismissive neglect. Now, this formidable man, whose very presence commanded London's respect, was interested in her. Her thoughts, her quiet opinions, the very essence of her guarded self. The color returned to her cheeks, her spine straightened with a newfound, fragile confidence, and the guarded, hesitant way she spoke began to melt away when she was with him. Their encounters grew increasingly intimate, full of charged silence and the breathless anticipation of unspoken desire. One evening, at a small, rather dull musical soirée, they found themselves standing near an open French door leading to the cold night air. The music provided a thin screen of sound against the vast, dark quiet. "Tell me, Lady Juliana," Alistair murmured, his voice pitched low, "what is it you truly fear in the world?" It was a question far too deep for polite society, cutting through the layers of artifice they were all obliged to wear. Juliana looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide and serious. "I fear being seen for what I truly am," she confessed quietly. "Unremarkable, unworthy of the great hopes and expectations that drive this world." Alistair felt a sharp, unexpected pain in his chest. "I disagree," he said, taking a step closer, reducing the distance between them until she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. What I see is a profound, generous mind, Lady Juliana, and a spirit that is already broken by others, long before I ever came near you. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from her face, tracing the trajectory of a wayward curl with his thumb. It was a hesitant touch, a profound intimacy born not of flirtation, but of sudden, shared vulnerability. Juliana's breath hitched. She should have pulled away. She should have made some appropriate, witty remark about the draft, but she could not move. The sheer intensity of his gaze, dark, penetrating, and utterly focused only on her, held her captive. "Alistair," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, testing the sound of it on her tongue. He closed the final distance. His hand moved from her curl to cup her cheek, the leather of his glove warm against her skin. "I find you far from unremarkable, Juliana," he said, his voice husky with a desire he was finding impossible to contain. "I find you everything." And then his lips were on hers. It was not a hasty, scandalous kiss, but a deep, searching confirmation of the electric current that had sparked between them since the day in the bookshop. It was a kiss full of yearning, fear, and a terrifying, unspoken promise that shattered the careful facade of their acquaintance. As he pulled away, Alistair felt a sickening lurch in his conscience. He was still the predator, and she the unwitting prey. His intention had been to compromise her, and yet the moment had been so overwhelmingly real, so unlike the calculated ruin he had planned, that it terrified him more than any public scandal could. The conflict within Alistair drove him into a frenzied research. He was desperate to find a reason, any reason, to justify his continuing pursuit of Juliana, or perhaps a compelling reason to halt his original wicked plan. He had dedicated his research to Clarissa's public accusation 5 years prior, the charge that Alistair had misused funds intended for a military regiment. The Duke had always believed the charge was a malicious lie, concocted by Clarissa simply to spite him. Now, as he pored over old correspondence and financial records, he began to see a disturbing pattern. The discrepancies in the ledger were real, but the timing was off. Clarissa had publicly exposed him at the ball, but the true trail of misappropriation seemed to lead back further, organized with a sophistication that Clarissa, for all her vanity, did not possess. While tracking a series of forged receipts that had been used to frame him, Alistair uncovered a hidden account, a carefully obscured shadow ledger that documented a scheme of embezzlement and systematic framing. The shock was immediate and devastating. It wasn't Juliana's sister who had ruined him. Clarissa had only been the loudspeaker, the unwitting dupe. The true orchestrator of his ruin, the man who had initiated the frame-up 5 years ago to cover a deeper, ongoing corruption that had now ballooned into a colossal threat to Alistair's estate, was Mr. Silas Thorne, his most trusted advisor and estate solicitor. Thorne had framed Alistair, then used Clarissa's very public spat to deflect all suspicion onto the Whitlocks. The revelation hit Alistair with the physical force of a blow. He had spent 5 years nursing a cold, brutal revenge against an innocent family, and worst of all, he had cultivated the affection of their most genuine daughter, knowing he intended to destroy her. At that very moment, the moment the truth was laid bare in Alistair's study, Juliana's world imploded a few miles away. She had been visiting the Duke's townhome to return the borrowed volume of Tacitus. She found the house deserted save for a nervous footman, and was shown into the Duke's study to wait. It was there, upon a mahogany side cable beneath a scattering of old maps, that she saw a leather-bound, gilt-edged journal. It was clearly her sister Clarissa's handwriting. Curiosity, combined with a familiar, painful sibling rivalry, compelled her. She opened it, not to the usual girlish musings, but to a meticulously detailed, almost clinical account of society figures, a poison pen journal. And there, near the front, was an entry marked 5 years ago, chronicling Clarissa's infamous run-in with the Marquis of Ravensbury. Juliana did not read the entire entry. Her eyes landed on a loose sheet of parchment tucked inside, a rough draft of a letter, not in Clarissa's hand, but in the Duke's. It was a detailed, chilling plan, dated only a month prior, laying out the steps for the gradual, irreversible ruin of the Whitlock family through the calculated yet discreet compromise of the innocent younger daughter, Lady Juliana. The words blurred before her eyes, coalescing into a single, agonizing reality. The stolen kisses, the deep, searching conversations, the rare books, the dazzling smiles, all of it had been a lie, a calculated, wicked trap. She was not worthy of his attention. She was merely a tool for his retribution. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, the journal falling to the Persian carpet. At that exact, crushing moment, the study door flew open. Alistair Vane stood framed in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes alight with a mixture of shock and devastating realization. In his hand he held the very evidence that would clear Juliana's entire family, the shadow ledger detailing Thorne's long-standing corruption and condemn his own most trusted advisor. He saw Juliana, white-faced and trembling, staring at the damning letter on the floor. "Juliana," he began, the name a painful, ragged whisper. She did not wait for him to finish. With a gasp that tore from her throat, a sound of utter heartbreak and devastation, she fled, leaving behind her all the shattered pieces of her foolish, tender heart, and the Duke, his vengeful plot revealed, his innocence discovered, standing alone, clutching the proof of a deeper corruption. Chapter 3. The Cost of Choosing Her. Juliana's flight was not merely from the Duke's house, but from the searing pain of betrayal. She locked herself within the familiar, yet suddenly alien walls of Whitlock House, a ghost moving through the rooms. The grief was so absolute it paralyzed her, eclipsing all other concerns, even the faint flicker of relief that her family might be spared ruin. The truth was not merely that the Duke had planned to destroy her. The deeper cut was that the intimacy, the connection she prized above all else, had been nothing but a calculated tool. She refused every single communication from the Duke of Ravensbury. Notes delivered by his anxious footman were returned unopened. When he called, she directed the butler to state she was indisposed, confined to her rooms, or not receiving. Her heart was a fortress now, breached and painfully rebuilt with walls of granite reserve. Alistair, meanwhile, was grappling with a choice that felt less like a decision and more like an execution. The shadow ledger confirmed the treachery of Silas Thorne, an advisor he had trusted implicitly since childhood. Exposing Thorne would mean revealing that the corruption had operated for years under the very nose of the Duke of Ravensbury. It would open his estates to financial scrutiny, lead to public inquiry, and irrevocably damage the reputation he had painstakingly rebuilt since his return to London. He would lose his political power, his social influence, and face potentially crippling financial consequences. He would, essentially, cease to be the powerful Duke of Ravensbury. He had two paths. One, sacrifice Juliana again. He could bury the ledger, quietly dismiss Thorne under a fabricated excuse, and use his remaining power to shield the Whitlocks just enough to make amends to Juliana, maintaining his title and wealth. But this would mean living a lie, protecting the very corruption that had nearly destroyed him, and asking Juliana to accept a man who had chosen his gilded cage over the truth. 2. Expose the traitor. He could publicly destroy Thorne, which would vindicate the Whitlocks completely and clear Clarissa's name from being the initial perpetrator, but cost him his entire standing in society. The realization was stark. The revenge he had intended to exact upon a guilty family was now demanding the sacrifice of his entire powerful identity to save an innocent woman he had come to love. He looked at the small leather-bound book he had rescued from the mud that morning, a volume of poetry Juliana had dropped in her haste to flee. The sight of her marginalia, her thoughtful, sharp observations written in a delicate hand, finally broke him. He could not live another day as a lie, especially not a lie that stood between him and the only truth he had ever found. The declaration was not made in a grand ballroom, but in the dreary, public setting of the House of Lords. Alistair called for an emergency meeting, not to debate policy, but to deliver a devastating personal statement. He stood before his peers, stripped of the usual rhetorical flourish, and laid bare the truth of Thorne's corruption, providing the ledgers and damning proof of his treachery. The shock was seismic. Whispers turned to gasps, then to furious, defensive denials from the few who still stood to gain from the old order. Alistair did not flinch. He sacrificed his carefully managed reputation entirely, admitting his blindness to Thorne's actions and taking full responsibility for the fallout. He publicly retracted the long-standing societal condemnation of the Whitlocks, stating clearly that Lady Clarissa had been an unwitting participant in a deeper plot. It was a public, agonizing suicide of his political career. By the time he left the house, his influence was crippled, his financial standing precarious under the weight of necessary reparations, and his name, though cleared of the old lie, was now mired in the new scandal of his household's failure. He was, to the ton, a ruined man, a duke in title only, stripped of the power that defined him. His last destination was Whitlock House. He stood before the familiar oak door, no longer wearing the impenetrable armor of the Duke of Ravensbury, but the simple coat of a man who had chosen honor over ambition. This time, the butler, seeing the ravaged look in his eyes, and having heard the staggering gossip from Westminster, allowed him to wait in the drawing-room. Juliana descended the stairs not long after, wearing a simple black gown. Her composure was absolute, betraying none of the internal devastation that still raged. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cool and level, "I believe we have nothing further to discuss. The debt of your humiliation has been repaid, not by my ruin, but by the ruin of your adviser. Your conscience may now rest." Alistair looked at her, truly seeing the depth of her pain, the pain he had inflicted. "Juliana, please, I have not come to make amends for the lie I told you. I have come to confess the truth I discovered," he began, moving slowly toward her. "When I saw the proof of my adviser's treachery, it was a profound shock. But when I saw your face, seeing the letter of my original intent, that, Juliana, was the true devastation. He pulled a thin vellum from his pocket. It was the deed to a remote, respectable, but modest dower house he owned in Devon, a house Thorne had not touched in his financial schemes. I have spent the morning stripping away every deception, he said, laying the deed on the mantelpiece. I have just come from Parliament. I have publicly exposed Thorne and taken responsibility for the chaos he caused. I have sacrificed my political standing and a great deal of my wealth. I will be spending the next several years rebuilding what was lost, not as a great powerful duke, but as a man whose name is now inextricably linked with scandal and financial uncertainty. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze raw with desperate sincerity. I have nothing left to offer you, Juliana. No title to impress your mother, no vast fortune to save your father. The man who stands before you is the man I should have been 5 years ago, flawed, humbled, and finally, truly honest. I came here with malice in my heart, determined to destroy you. But the only thing I destroyed was my own cold indifference. The truth is, I love the woman you are, not the victim I chose. He took a step back, leaving the deed on the mantelpiece, a worthless offering in the face of what he had taken. I have nothing left to give you, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion, except the truth and my heart. Take them or leave them, but know that I shall never cease to regret the cost of our acquaintance. He turned to leave, his long, weary strides echoing in the silence of the room. Juliana watched him go, tears finally burning in her eyes. The power was gone, the armor was shed. What stood before her was not the manipulative, formidable Duke, but Alistair Vane, broken and redeemed, sacrificing his world to vindicate her family. As his hand touched the doorknob, Juliana finally spoke, her voice shaking but resolute. "Alistair," she called, using his name again, the sound now weighted with love and forgiveness. He stopped, turning slowly. She walked towards him, her steps measured, and gently lifted the deed from the mantelpiece, placing it back on the marble. "I have no need of your dower house, your grace," she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "And I never desired the Duke of Ravensbury, the man of wealth and power." She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had first saved her, then nearly ruined her, and had now sacrificed everything for her. "I accept the man who chooses truth above all else. I accept your heart, Alistair. And I choose you, not as a duke, but as a man finally redeemed." He pulled her into his arms, a gesture of profound relief and abiding love, confirming that their romance was not born from the expectations of society, but forged in the fire of truth and the quiet strength of her forgiveness.